All right. Hey, everybody. It's Dr. Karen. And this morning I am here with Tracy Sippl from S L Teletherapy Consultants. And we're going to dive into some questions about teletherapy for speech pathologists. So, Tracy, first of all, thank you so much for being here with me today and answering some questions. And I was just wondering if you could start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got to be where you are right now.
Sure. Well, thank you. And good morning to you. And thank you for having me on. I've been a speech language pathologist for over 30 years, which really dates me, and worked with pre-K through 12th grade for the majority of that time. 24 of those years were spent working on site in schools. And the last 7 to 8 have been providing telepractice services, and then I began my consulting business. And one of the reasons why I looked toward telepractice approximately 8 years ago was because of I found I was providing less and less therapy because of other responsibilities that were added to my list, as most SLPs working on site in schools can definitely relate to. So I was doing more things like proctoring state testing, and the duties just began to grow, and I felt like I was being pulled farther and farther from actually being able to do therapy, which is what I love. So I thought, well, at that point, technology was reaching, to new levels, and I thought there's got to be a way that for the kids that either are very remote or aren't able to receive services, there has to be a way to do that via technology, and that's kind of when telepractice was just starting to take hold in our profession.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And certainly now with a lot of the different options for technology, I think we're probably realizing that we can do a lot more than we think we can online.
Right. It's interesting because I know, talking with some other colleagues, that physical therapy, I think it is, or maybe even just in the medical setting, where they're able to do like swallow studies via haptic, like a glove. You would be able to, the client would have a glove on and hold it on their throat, and you're in a remote area, having the glove and can feel the swallow. Things like that. It's just astonishing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm curious, and a lot of the people who are in my audience have asked some questions about how to get started if they are, number one, maybe in a school position and they're thinking some of the same things that you are, like, wow, I'm asked to do all these other things and I really just want to do therapy. So maybe they're interested in figuring out what else is out there, but also maybe if they're in a situation where online therapy is the only option, whether it's a crisis situation and we have to do therapy online, or whether it's serving people in an area that wouldn't normally be able to get services. One of the biggest questions that I've gotten is just, what platform do you use? I mean, what technology is available? What's the best option? So what are some, for people starting out, what platforms do they need to be aware of?
There are actually a number of different ones to choose from. It kind of depends. If you're in a situation like with the pandemic right now, a lot of school districts are requiring their usually on-site SLPs to provide telepractice. And so they're more required to follow or use the platform that the school district is choosing or has access to, like Google Classroom for the teachers. Therefore, Google Hangout Meets is one that a lot of districts are turning to, and having their SLPs look at and get familiar with. If you're a private practitioner and you're looking at considering different platforms, WebEx has GoToMeeting, has another, their DoxyMe, I've heard. I don't have a lot of experience with that one. Video is another one. Their platform. Video, it's like VYDEO, I think it's
okay.
spelled. Then in terms of like for more therapy specific would be TheraPlatform, and Blink Sessions is another one. The differences between some of those is the ones that are more therapy specific offer online billing, online scheduling, and those types of services all rolled into one. So it's not only the platform you use to provide the services, but you have, those other capabilities as well. If you're looking at something where you want just the straight video conferencing system that has tools, that's HIPAA compliant, and it has tools built in that allows you to interact with materials with clients, then Zoom, like we're using today, or WebEx, GoToMeeting, those are just strictly video conferencing platforms.
Okay.
So it really just depends on what you're looking for in terms of capabilities. Do you want to have just the video conferencing platform because you already have billing capabilities and scheduling capabilities? That's when you would probably look towards Zoom or GoToMeeting or WebEx, those types of situations. So I know I have experience with WebEx and GoToMeeting, but years ago when it was more, that was one of the differentiating factors between Zoom and those. Zoom would give you the tools to use to interact, where WebEx and GoToMeeting were more strictly video conferencing, like business-based. So but they've come a long way too. So it's really a matter of doing your research and knowing what you want in a particular platform.
So all those that you listed just now, and obviously for anybody listening, if we mention any of these resources, we will post some links below this video so you can get some more information for any of these platform options that we've discussed. But all of those have HIPAA compliant options if you're using the platform the right way. Is that correct?
They do. It just depends on how much you're willing to pay. So,
okay.
Like unfortunately, Zoom has the healthcare version, which is the only version that has the BAA, or Business Associate Agreement, which is the document saying we are HIPAA compliant. If there were to be a breach, this is what we do, and everything's in place for that. Unfortunately, that's like $200 a month. The other options that I'd mentioned previously are less expensive, but it does take some research to find out and make sure that you have access to that BAA or have that document so that you can show to your clients if you need to, those types of things, to have that in place to make sure that you're following the HIPAA regulations.
So really, regardless of what platform you use, you want to make sure that you have that BAA before you start using it, so that you've got that written document that says this is what we do. And so really that procedure is a prerequisite for any of those things, that any of those platforms that you would choose.
Yes, good point. Exactly.
And so for SLPs who are, let's say they're in a school, they're in a situation where there's a lockdown and they have to provide therapy, does the school usually have a BAA already through their organization? Or is that something they would need to do?
If they're using an online system, I can't speak, for every district, but my understanding would be that the majority do have that BAA, because if they're using Google Classrooms, it has to be a HIPAA compliant. But I would always ask just to make sure.
Okay. So most of the time they're probably covered, but it's always just something that the SLP should ask their district if they have it, just to make sure they're covering their bases.
Right.
Okay. So let's see, let me back up. We were talking about the platforms, and with all of those different options, you had talked about how some of them are video conferencing only, like this right now, but I believe, does Zoom Healthcare have that option for billing and all of those other features that you mentioned?
That's a great question. I honestly am not sure.
Okay.
My understanding is no, only because they're built to be a video conferencing system. They aren't made for therapy purposes. The only difference being is that the higher cost, like the amount I mentioned per month, gives you that document saying that they're HIPAA compliant. There are versions below that you don't pay as much per month, but my understanding is then they do not have the end-to-end encryption, the things that they need to be HIPAA compliant, and then you don't have access to that BAA document as well.
Yeah. So a couple questions about that. I know that and right now, obviously, as we're recording this, it might be up after. So if you're listening to this long after, it might not apply. But as we're recording this, we're in the middle of the pandemic, and HIPAA has relaxed some of the guidelines. And so some people are using some of these platforms, such as Zoom, on one of those less expensive plans. And is HIPAA okay with that right now, based on the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic? Have they relaxed their guidelines?
My understanding is they have somewhat. When I read some of the literature coming through, though, it's really confusing,
Hmm.
and it changes almost hourly.
Yeah,
So
I've
I
noticed that.
know, yeah. My recommendation is if you're going to be doing telepractice and you're not sure how long, if it's strictly because of the pandemic
Right.
or if, if there's an opportunity that you're going to continue doing this or the district is going to continue to provide this in any shape or form, I
Hmm.
recommend, and I think most of the people on the coordinating committee would agree with me, is to start out doing it the right way in the beginning.
Right. Hmm.
So yes, there may be some loosening of the regulations in terms of HIPAA, but that to me isn't a go card, to so to speak. It relaxes some things, but at the same point, they're going to be going back to where they are, where they should be.
Hmm.
So rather than have to take that leap backward and undo everything that you've done, basically,
Right.
because things may not transfer, to start off on the right foot and then have that BAA from the beginning would be the best.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. So, are there any other options as far as, and I am talking about Zoom because a lot of people have asked about it, because I think that the two that I've talked about the most with my particular audience is Zoom and Google Meet, because those aren't just teletherapy platforms. A lot of other people know how to use them. So from a standpoint of training parents, things like that, and what the school district might already be using, what other people might already be using. A lot of people are familiar with those platforms. And so we've talked a lot about those two. It looks like Google Meet is a less expensive option that does give you that HIPAA compliant version that they could be using right away. And what about, are there any other options or ways that you can get past having to use that healthcare plan with Zoom? Are there any other plans and ways that you can use the platform in a way that's HIPAA compliant without having to go to the full healthcare plan?
At this point, because they have loosened the regulations, I've been mentioned to people, especially private practitioners, that are like, well, I want to start out doing this. I have to start out doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no way I can afford the $200 a month.
Right.
Um, it's not just about the platform being HIPAA compliant, but also the clinician's practices.
Mm-hmm.
So, using a laptop that's password protected, which most are. Having a platform which is password protected, which Zoom is, which Google Hangout Meets is, and most platforms you have to sign into them to be able to use them. Having a documentation in place that you generate, you can go online and do a search to find out what things need to be in a BAA. And if you can
Okay.
document that, how you could manage those steps, like, having a list of steps that you would follow if there were to be a breach in your system. The fact that you're not recording sessions, because that's just another form of information floating around out there that could potentially be hacked. So you're not doing that. You are requiring a password for your clients to access this platform to join you for a session. Those types of things, if you can document how you would do that and you have those in place and how you would notify your clients if there were to be a breach, that's the type of documentation that HIPAA looks for,
Okay.
requires, and provided you have those documents in your hand and you've provided those to your clients and had them sign off so they understand, we're using this form of Zoom. It may not have the business associate agreement, but this is the documentation that I have in place of it, and they sign off on it, then at least during this pandemic time, I think you're okay. Beyond that, I would consult a lawyer just to make
Yeah, I
sure
was
that
going
you
to
have
ask,
everything.
could you just, if you wanted to maybe pay something up front, but not have to pay for the long haul, could you have an attorney draft something for you for a private practice? Or if you were going to take on some private clients and wanted to make sure you were doing things right, could you have an attorney do that and look over things for you?
That's what I would recommend. And they would be able to tell you, there's no getting around this. You're going to have to definitely do it this way now that the regulations have gone back to normal.
Right.
Or, there may be, again, following the protocols of making sure that you are following Not leaving materials laying out on your desk if you're working from home. So confidentiality, like you would if you were working on site in an office, having a door and that it locks, or having a file cabinet with the files, any hard copy materials that have clients identifying information unlocked. That you have those types of things in place as well. May be enough, but again, talking to that lawyer to find out if that's actually the case would be the best advice, I think.
Yeah. I actually had an SLP on the other day ask, you know what, I've got a couple private clients. I've told them, if I tell them this isn't the HIPAA compliant version of Zoom and they're okay with that, can I have them sign something? That would essentially be the procedure you'd recommend, is have them sign some type of agreement, preferably one you've consulted a lawyer about coming up with, and have them sign off on it to make sure that it's legally compliant.
I agree.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. My response was, I always err on the side of being more conservative when it comes to patient privacy, but I wanted to just see if there was an option, because I know that honestly, there are some parents that probably would just say, I don't care. I just want my child to have services. I don't know about all this compliance stuff, but right. That we also do need to protect ourselves as well and make sure that we're standing up for their rights, even if they might not be aware of all of the different legal things that we have to think about.
True. And that's a good point too. If I could just mention, making sure that you have your malpractice insurance.
Yeah.
So, that's probably the most important thing when you're working from home or anything, to have that in place first and above all. So
right. Regardless if you're doing in person, going into people's homes, in an office, or wherever.
Exactly.
So I know we've been talking a lot about the legal stuff. I wanted to shift a little bit and talk about equipment and things like that. Is there anything else from a legal standpoint or from a patient privacy standpoint that you would want people to know before we shift gears?
Not in terms of platforms, those types of things, but just the fact, again, having an office that's confidential. So especially with a lot of families having children at home, online schooling, and you're trying to conduct a therapy session. So the privacy issue, having a room with a door that you can close, not being interrupted, those types of confidentiality things. You don't want people walking through the background of your video as you're treating somebody, because that wouldn't bode well. So, but that's about all I can think of.
Or don't be doing laundry while you're doing a therapy session.
That leads into the whole ethics thing. Yes.
Yeah. Well, and I think we did plan on talking about that in a few minutes, but so what, as far as equipment, if people need to get started, what equipment is absolutely essential that they should start thinking about?
Great question. A computer. And I recommend it not to be my ideal situation would be less than 3 years old, but obviously we have to make do with what we have at this point in time with the pandemic. But if it can be less than 5 years old, that would be acceptable. The only reason I mention that is because a lot of the processors that are in laptops and computers that are older than that are not necessarily capable of handling what telepractice needs in terms of running the different programs, sharing the internet, interacting with materials. So that's a big one. Make sure that it has an embedded webcam. Ideally, down the road, if you're interested, you can invest in an external webcam, but make sure that the laptop has a camera built into it. Again, older models do not always have that. So if it doesn't have a camera, then you're going to have to do an external webcam. But, so there needs to be a camera of some sort. And then I recommend having a headset with a built-in microphone, especially if you're working with articulation or voice clients, just any clients basically, because it gives you the capability of hearing them that much better. And one that has the binaural or both ears receive the signal, not just one, because I've seen the headsets with one ear and then you've got like the tension piece on the other side, but you want something that you're going to be able to hear with both ears. So if you don't have a headset, you're still going to need some type of microphone. And some laptops have them, but they're usually very poor quality. You can make do with that if you absolutely have to. But otherwise, I would recommend a headset or some type of external microphone. So check out what you have or built into your computer already and see what you can do with that. And then you're going to need a mouse. So to be able to manipulate materials on the screen, the little touch pads like they have on some of the computers now are doable, but they're really difficult. I've talked to many people that said, I'm not even going to try to do therapy with that thing.
Yeah.
So a mouse of some sort. And then an office with a door, like I mentioned, a private place to be able to provide those services. So those would be the bare basics, I believe.
Do you recommend people, and also tell their clients this as well, but say, monitor what else is streaming in the house at the same time for bandwidth purposes? Like, don't be watching Netflix while you're doing, or have somebody over here gaming or doing something that's using a lot of bandwidth while you're doing your therapy session. Does that have an impact?
It does. So that leads to the point you have to have internet to be able to do remote services. So, but that's a really good point because of the fact, what I recommend for people is to be Ethernet cabled right to the router, if at all possible. Because of the fact that that's the most stable, reliable connection. The reason being, like you mentioned, if you're relying on Wi-Fi, and I know Wi-Fi's come a long way over the last 5 years. If anybody else in the house, anything else in the house is drawing from that bandwidth, that internet at the same time that you're trying to provide services, you're competing for that bandwidth. And you don't always end up winning that battle. So if you have, the Ring doorbell that draws from the internet, if you have clothes washer and dryer, dishwasher, any appliance that draws from the internet, those are actually pulling in the background that you may not be aware of.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and people in the house too, if you have other children at home, or, now both spouses are working from home. So if the one spouse is drawing on the internet for their job and you're trying to do telepractice, plus the kids are doing their online learning, it gets to be a really difficult situation. So I recommend usually trying to find a time where not everybody else has to be on at the same time, with a minimal amount of other people interacting or things interacting with the internet might be the best time to plan to do telepractice. But besides you drawing on your Wi-Fi, that's why I recommend Ethernet cabled. Most of the time, your clients are not going to be Ethernet cabled. Probably 99% of the time, they'll be relying on their Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
You're competing on your end and you're trying to make things work, and they're competing on their end trying to make things work. It really can create some difficult situations. You disconnect, you lose your signal, the screen freezes, you can't hear the other person. So it can be really difficult. So if you can be Ethernet cable, that at least removes the competition for the Wi-Fi and stability on your end, and then you can try to help the client problem solve their end. So.
Right. Is there a recommended upload and download or processing speed with your internet? Because I know that when I've interviewed with different companies, they've said that in the setup that you need a certain requirement there.
Yes, and it's actually come a long way, because I know when I see Spectrum and different companies advertise on TV, they're like 100 millibytes a second. The lowest I would recommend would be 3 megabytes per second.
Okay.
And most people, if you have DSL, you have cable, not satellite, DSL or cable, you're fine. You can do a speed test. There's a website, www.speedtest.net. And that'll run the test for you and tell you what your uploads and downloads are. Now, your download is usually the faster of the two, the higher of the two numbers, and your upload tends to be the lower. You want to make sure at least the upload is at least 3 megabytes per second. If you're at like 1, which in some rural areas we have, really difficult time getting internet. We're lucky if we can make that 1 megabyte per second criteria. Then you're going to, again, it's just going to be a problematic situation. You're just going to be running into a lot of issues. So, but ideally, 5 above, 10 above, 10 millibytes per second. Again, the upload needs to be at least that. And if the upload is, typically the download is that or higher. So.
Yeah. And they should probably I've noticed that sometimes we have very fast internet, but then sometimes I'm sitting here and it's waiting and it's not uploading. And I'm like, what's going on here? I go and do, because it's speed test. You just Google speed test, right? To get that website and you can see what your internet is. And I've gone in and my speed is way lower. And I'm sitting here like, we're paying for high speed. What's going on here? Yeah. And we've had to go in and reset our modem, and then it's gone back up. So people should do the test and then probably check their hardware in their house as well. Because if their modem is bad, or the modem and the router and all of that stuff, if it's old or broken, they might not be getting all of their bandwidth that they have access to, right? So they need
right. Yeah, right. Sure. Router just, yeah. And if you do have difficulties, you can, if your speed's low, first thing I would probably try is shutting everything down, turn off the computer, turn off your router, unplug your router, leave it unplugged for a couple minutes, plug it back in, start your computer back up, run the test again and see if that helps. Because sometimes it's just a matter of like it recalibrates itself.
Right. Yeah. And that's on our end, that's usually what I've had to do when something wasn't working online. But yeah. All kinds of little things. I guess knowing all of those things could probably help them talk their clients through that as well. If they were to get disconnected and the internet went out, and you could talk them through resetting their router or whatever they needed to do.
Right. And that actually is a plan that I mentioned to people. Think about ahead of time the steps you feel you would need to tell a parent. Like if you're coming to this without knowing anything, what would be the steps that you would ask them to take, and make a checklist for yourself or even for the parent and say, okay, so first you're going to need to make sure you test your internet speed so we know and what type of internet you're using. So going through those things with the parent ahead of time before you even begin to schedule your first session is really important, as well as doing like a trial run. Once you have everything in place, say, okay, we're going to meet just to make sure everything's up and running before we meet with the student, because the last thing you need is trying to problem solve and troubleshoot when the child's sitting there.
Yeah. Oh, I know that.
Yes.
I can imagine that, where you're sweating and freaking out.
Yeah. It can be for a very stressful situation.
Yeah. Do you recommend that SLPs maybe, call a family member and do a practice test before they do this with the client?
Yes. If you're new to telepractice at all, that's one of the things I really wanted to make sure I stressed today is practice. Practice using the platform. You're not going to break it. Practice, pulling up any type of material, worksheets, videos, websites, anything. Use those tools so they become very comfortable for you, because you can think you know how to do it and you feel like, yeah, I've got this, and then jump into a session and whether it's the student having behavior issues or you're having connectivity issues or anything like that, all of a sudden you kind of forget about everything you practice. And it's like, how do I do that again?
Yeah.
So trying to practice it so it's almost second nature. So with a friend, even with yourself, at one point I set up an extra laptop I had at home next to me. Yeah, and I could see what the client could see then. So it helped.
Right.
I could have a visual in terms of, okay, so when I do this, when I share this on my computer, that's what it'll look like on my client's computer. Okay.
Yeah, I can think of many times where I've gone and done a presentation live and not known what's gone through the entire presentation and realized my slide deck was frozen for the last hour. So
yeah, yep, exactly.
Yeah. So obviously you want to do as much as you possibly can to be prepared. It's ironic, we haven't even talked about therapy yet. We're talking all about this technology before we even talk about therapy techniques.
Right.
But for people who are just feeling very apprehensive about this, what would you say to them if they're thinking, oh my gosh, I have to have every single troubleshooting thing figured out beforehand? I mean, obviously there's no way you can do that. There are things that are just going to come up. What would you tell people who are thinking that right now and feeling worried about that?
You have to work on self-love. It really comes into having that flexibility and giving yourself a break, because of the fact that I can almost guarantee at some point you're going to run into some type of technological issue. And no, you may not be able to solve it on the spot. Worst case scenario, you end up having to cancel the session. Really, I mean, if you want to try to work through it with the parent, that's fine. Otherwise, there's nothing wrong with saying, you know what, this is something I really need to look into. Can we reschedule this session for your child? I don't want to waste your time, and that'll give me a chance to really, get a hold of this. So, and I think the parent would respect that more than watching you try to fumble through figuring out what's not right, or that type of thing. Or, if it takes a little while to solve that problem, I typically will keep track of the minutes that I lose, and I'll tag those on. I'll talk to the parent at the end and just say, you know what, it took me 10 minutes to work through that problem. I want to make sure I make up those minutes with your child. So can we schedule an extra few minutes on the end of the next 3 sessions or something?
Right.
Like
Mm-hmm.
so, but yeah, it can be overwhelming when you first start. So that's the practicing really does help, especially with somebody that, maybe a neighbor or a friend, someone that you're not the most comfortable with, because it kind of simulates that situation. But at the same time, you're only human. You can only do so much. Technology does not always cooperate, as most people already know.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, I think that's a helpful perspective. I think there's a lot of people who are there's always that learning curve when you learn something new, when it's technology, when it's unfamiliar. So I think that's really helpful.
Yeah.
So,
And I'm sorry. I was just
oh
going to
no,
mention.
go ahead.
I still get nervous when I come on, when I work with a student in my first session of the day. And once I get rolling, it's usually fine. But I try to use that adrenaline rush for a positive.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll work it to my advantage or that type of thing. But yeah, with the rest of us, I mean, we're not always calm and easygoing as we might look at times. There's still always that thought of, okay, you got to be ready for anything. And you can try to prepare, but there's only so much you can do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's, in a way, it's different from being in person, but there's always something. I mean, there's always something that could go wrong. So it's not that much different. It's just a different set of things that you might have to work through.
Right. Exactly.
So when it comes to, we talked about the compliance issues. So obviously there's all those privacy, managing data, things like that. But what other things besides just maintaining privacy and data do people need to think about when it comes to ethics overall with teletherapy that maybe wouldn't be things that you would talk about with in-person therapy?
Quite a few considerations, actually. I think what I've come across over time has been the fact, I think this is my interpretation anyway, I think people feel more comfortable working from home and it's their turf. So not having to go into an office sometimes may take the form of, well, I can be a little more relaxed about things while I'm providing therapy services from home. For example, people have mentioned clinicians sleeping into the last 5 minutes before a session for the beginning session of the day. Person jumps out of bed, throws on a pair of sweats, hair in a ponytail, grabs a cup of coffee, sits down, and starts providing services. Best practice would say, you want to be, dressed professionally, provide that professional impression. So my rule of thumb is, if you wouldn't wear it or look that way going into an office, don't bring it to teletherapy. So if you would normally, whether it's grooming or makeup, whatever the case may be, you want that professional impression. So maybe you don't need to wear the heels, but you'd want to wear, the dress top and dress pants, that type of thing. I've heard stories of clinicians working in their underwear. They're dressed professionally from the top to the waist, and then the rest isn't. And then they've forgotten that they're not fully clothed or have pajama bottoms on, and stood up to grab something, and the parent sees. To women folding laundry on the bed behind them because they're using a spare bedroom for an office. They're folding laundry on the bed behind them while they're providing services. There's a number of different things that have happened. One person had shared that they did not close their office door all the way, and their 2 large dogs came into the room, jumped on the bed behind them, and began to get sick. Oh. This was in the middle of, the woman was holding an IEP meeting. So everybody on the other end at the school that were in the conference room watched on the computer as these 2 big dogs were getting sick, and she's trying to, conduct the meeting. And it's like, okay, again, would you bring your dogs to the office? Now, she didn't deliberately bring them in, but because the door wasn't closed all the way, which is that confidentiality factor and interruption factor, different things can happen. So you don't want to put yourself in that position. Again, if you wouldn't wear it to the office, you wouldn't bring it to the office. Some, kids are crawling in on the floor, interrupting sessions like that, or a parent as a clinician might feel, oh, I'll bring my baby with me. Would you bring your baby to the office? Probably not. Then you have to make sure that you have accommodations in place so that doesn't happen during telepractice. So, yeah.
So as far as office setup goes, to piggyback on that point, what kind of things should clinicians think about when they're just setting up their environment to make sure that they are in their mind thinking of this as, I'm at work now, when they set their office up, and I'm providing an environment that when people sign on to work with me and they see this, they're going to feel like they're in a therapy session.
Right. Good. The space that you're going to use, which I mentioned again, and I keep reiterating, it should have a door for obvious reasons. If you have a bed behind you, look at the background when you start to see, it's like, okay, what do they see behind me? Does this look professional? Now, I was working from a spare bedroom that had a bed behind me. So what I did was I purchased like a trifold screen initially. Also, I've used a green screen behind me, or even a decorative curtain, something to cover up the bedroom aspect of it to make it look more professional. Some of the platforms will have, like Zoom has a virtual background. You can upload a picture and have it behind you if you want, those types of things. Having a space for you to work from, whether that's a table or a desk, something where you can have your materials, whether it's lesson plans or anything you might need for a session in front of you. And keeping things organized. You don't want to have to be digging in, a tote over here for a toy you want to show the child if you're doing that, or papers that you have to reference when you're talking to a parent. That should all be organized on your desk and you're prepared ahead of time in front of you. Having a window, you don't want to sit with your back to a window because then the camera picks up your silhouette and the client won't be able to see you, right? If you're sitting in front of a window where the light's coming in at you, the sunlight, it's going to wash you out and still make you difficult to see. So I usually recommend having a window off to the side and in front of your desk or where you're sitting, and then supplement with a lamp. Now I have a window, I have my overhead light, and I also have a large lamp in the background. And that's enough not to create any shadows. And then my clients can see, whether we're working on articulation and oral motor, movements or whatever the case may be.
Or even if you had to do this or something like that, is there obviously there's the whiteboard feature that you can use with different platforms, but are there certain lighting tweaks you can make that would make it a little bit easier for them to see things that you maybe are writing on a board?
Yeah, that would be probably like a floor lamp alongside you that you could switch on. Something, play around with it, because it really depends on, if you're a person that does use like a whiteboard or, want to have some type of drawing capability next to you and physically instead of using it on the platform. Yeah, you're going to need to take those things into consideration, and the size of your picture. So if you're sharing material on the screen through a platform, it typically makes the video of the student or client and yourself very small. So I've run into it where, we'll be doing an activity, but then I want to model something. So then I have to, you just have to know how to use those tools again and toggle out of that video format. And it brings you up in a bigger picture, and then you can toggle back to do the activity again. And that all comes with time, but trying to figure those things out, like especially the lighting is huge. Trying not to have a really busy background. So like when I work with students, I typically take my banner down. So I'll just have a plain wall behind me. Or some people have bookshelves with books on it. Things like that look appropriate. It looks like a library or, some type of professional setting. You don't want to be conducting telepractice from outside on your patio. We've heard of that. From your RV or from a coffee shop. Things like that.
That would be noisy.
Those, yeah, besides being a number of HIPAA violations, those usually do not provide the type of stable connectivity that you need to provide telepractice. So besides being ethically, questionable.
Right. And you're always on a public network if you're in a coffee shop. So there's all kinds of issues there.
Yes. Yep. Exactly.
So you'd probably have to consider that even if you were emailing, if you're in a coffee shop working and you're working on paperwork and you're going to email somebody something, that's not secure either.
Right. Yeah, you'd have to have some type of emailing system, like through Google Hangout Meets, there's like a chat, but there's also an emailing capability. I'm not as familiar with that aspect of it because I don't deal with that as often. But yeah, there'd have to be some type of that, or you don't have any personal identifying information that has client, information on it.
So just be careful when you're emailing people. It's, a regular Gmail or text message is not going to be HIPAA compliant unless you're just saying confirming our appointment today at 4 or something that's not
correct.
Doesn't have any identifying information in it.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Okay. So obviously you as a clinician can set the stage for having your office set up in a way that looks professional, acting professional, getting yourself ready in time, having all the privacy and your technology set up so that you can be in a place to help your client. But what about when it comes to office setup? They're probably in their mind also, if we're more relaxed, they're probably going to be more relaxed as well. So maybe we have our things in order. Obviously, that's the first thing we can do. But if the people we're working with are also hopping on the session in their pajamas with somebody playing video games next to them, how can we set the stage for our clients and communicate that to them so they're also treating it the same way?
Great question. And I've done that. I've worked with middle school and high school students laying on their bed, and you see up their nose basically because they have their laptop sitting on their chest. Yeah. I think clarifying and explaining those expectations ahead of time, whether it's an older student or if it's a parent, explaining for the learning to take place, and I need the student to be focused, so minimalizing any distractions that could be an issue. I was just watching a webinar about the fact that even if it's like a younger child, just letting the parent know ahead of time okay, so if you're going to work, when we're done working on this, then you can go ahead and play this game, that type of thing. So helping parents explain those expectations to their child, really no matter what the age is, and making the therapy the focus. Is part of it, and making sure, like you mentioned, a student maybe having a sibling next to them playing, video games, that type of thing, removing any of those types of distractions, and they can take place after the session or before the session, just not during the session. I also mentioned to clinicians, we run into this in school all the time when we're working on site, where you have the student, you just got them seated and ready to start the session and they have to use the restroom, things like that.
Yeah.
I usually recommend have the parent let them know, say if you could 15 minutes ahead of time, have your child use the restroom, and if it's been a while, if they're hungry, give them a snack so they have a chance to eat it before we start, so that doesn't, that removes that issue in terms of the disruptions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I would imagine it the same, especially if they've recently had to make a shift, that everybody's a little off their routine. Yeah. Is it helpful to have them, if it's possible in their house, I know everybody has a different situation, but have a dedicated school area separate from play and recreation? Does it help them to get focused if there's an area where this is where we're doing schoolwork, this is where we're doing therapy in their house?
It does. That's a big issue. I run into that a number of times, and that's great advice. Designating an area like this is where we're going to do talk time, or this is where we're going to do speech. Gives the child clear boundaries, so they know when they're in that area, this is the expectation. And sometimes it takes a bit to establish that, but that's where having that parent facilitator is huge, because of the fact that, okay, it's a little one that keeps wanting to run away, trying to sit down, and developing a routine that they know and they understand that, this is the time and this is where we are. And when we're done, then you can do something else. But until then, this is what we're going to be doing. So,
Yeah.
and having any toys, trying to work with a child that's in a playroom, with toys in the background, trying to have them focus on the computer is a nightmare. So if you can kind of remove like you said, remove any of those distractions, that's a huge help.
Yeah, I would imagine so. And that's actually one of the next questions I had for you that's come up. A lot of the clinicians that I mentor in some of my programs have said, okay, I'm used to working in person where if they're not attending, you have certain ways when you're physically in the room with someone that you might redirect them, whether it might be, sitting next to them, making eye contact, getting in their line of vision that you wouldn't necessarily do if you're not in the room with them. So obviously the first thing that we would do is have that dedicated space, set those boundaries, things like that. I'm sure that would alleviate a lot of those issues, but what else can you do to maintain and manage behaviors and maintain attention for your clients during sessions when you're online?
That's another great question. It depends on the age of the client. And what I usually suggest is that you think about how you would handle it if you were on site, because you're going to be expecting the parent to do that. And you're going to probably have to train the parent on how to do that if they're not already familiar with that. You can kind of get a feel. Some parents, they may have their ways of dealing with different behaviors at home on their own, but they're never quite sure if that pertains to our sessions as well. They need clarification. So I would ask them questions like, so how do you deal with, behavior if your child, you want them to do something, but how typically do they listen? Do you have to have multiple reminders? Do they need some type of reinforcer where once we get this done, we can do this? And kind of rely on those types of things. Like you would maybe redirect a child when you're working with them on site by having a toy that they prefer off to the side and saying, when we're done working, we can play with that.
Yeah.
But having that available for the parent to be able to say, when we're done with talk time, we can go do this. So let's do our talk time now, and just kind of redirecting that way. In a way, your hands are tied because your hands aren't there. So if you can prepare ahead of time as much as possible, there are things that are going to come up that you like, oh my gosh, I never thought about that. That's perfectly fine. But then I work through that with the parent. I would actually sit down and talk with the parent and say, this might be a problem. We're going to lose a little bit of time if we have to deal with this quite often. So how can we problem solve that now? What would be something you think your child would respond to in order to avoid that situation? So it's a team approach because you're really relying on that parent.
It seems like there are a lot of things that have come up since a lot of people have switched to teletherapy or are thinking about it, where it's actually encouraging us to do something that we probably should already be doing, which is getting parents involved in therapy, reinforcing these things and being on a team with them. So in a way, there's a silver lining there if you're in a situation where you've got to change to something or where it's a little bit different because you're doing therapy online, where we actually might have more contact with the parents and have an opportunity to train them, because that's ultimately what is going to help that behavior generalize across settings.
Exactly. And that's one of the things I love about telepractice, especially if I'm working with a client, that the parent should be there. They really need to be there. And I know it's, especially with the pandemic and other siblings at home doing, whatever online schooling that need to be attended to. If there's any way possible to get it so the parent could be in that room with that child as much as possible during that session, I really encourage people to brainstorm that with the parent to figure out a way to do that, whether that be the other spouse take a break from what they're working on, watching the kids so that you can have the other parent or spouse in with the child during the session, because the carryover is huge. I remember working on site and I would do phonological therapy with the kids and be like, I would really, especially with the preschoolers, it'd be really nice to have the parent in here so they could practice this at home. And I remember trying to get over that hurdle of that fear of having a parent sitting there judging you while you're doing services. And
Yeah.
it really wasn't that bad. Once I did it and started doing it more often, I missed having the parent in there because it was so much, I felt like the sessions were that much more applicable because the parent could
Yeah.
take it home and do it. So I look at this in kind of that same context. It's like the parent's there to help. The parent's an invested person that wants therapy to be successful. They're not judging you. They want to make sure that this works for their kid.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can look at it as a team, you know, you two are working together. I think it takes away some of that fear of the judgment, that type of thing. And that also leads to the fact that when you're explaining to a parent what telepractice is, what it would look like, I even show the parents ahead of time, say, this is kind of what I'm going to be doing with your child. This is what it looks like, and letting them know, you know what you know.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, if they have questions, those types of things, they're welcome to ask them after the session. But during the session, you need to get a certain amount done during the certain amount of time. And not that you know everything, but this is what you're meant to do. This is your profession. So the parent can definitely ask questions. The hard part is sometimes not taking it personally, but being
Yeah.
able to answer them coming from a place of, oh, they're asking, they don't know, or they wouldn't be asking, type of thing.
Right. Yeah. So with those kids who maybe have some attention issues and you're thinking, oh my gosh, how is this going to work online? Or maybe some kids who are maybe have very significant needs,
Mm-hmm.
kids who use AAC or who have very low cognitive abilities, or according to the information that you have. Are there certain candidates that normally or that aren't good candidates for teletherapy, and how do you tell, and how do you make that determination as to whether or not this is something that is an effective mode for them? And obviously during a pandemic, our
Don't have a
mindset might be a
choice.
little different, but how do you make that determination?
One of the first things I look at is, does this child understand cause and effect? You know, do they understand, they click the mouse, something happens on the screen? Do they have that cognitive ability? Can they use a mouse, a keyboard, or a touch screen? You know, are they capable of the fine motor coordination, that type of thing as well? Eye-hand coordination kind of ties in with all of that too. Are they able to sit for certain periods of time? Working with a student that has to be moving constantly gets to be a challenge, and that's when I usually recommend going to like a play-based model, but you're parent coaching, you know,
Okay.
advising the session, that type of thing, and then having the parent do the activity while you coach them through it. So can the child tolerate headphones? Some children can't, and I usually recommend that they have headphones on their end as well. Again, being things as they are, you know, that may not be an option depending on finances and everything else for the clients. But that is a consideration if you're going to use headphones or you're relying on headphones on their end. Are they able to follow directions? And if not, then again, the play-based parent coaching type of model is going to be better. Are they able to see and hear well enough to be able to see the computer screen and hear the clinician, that type of thing? Not that those are things like, oh, nope, they can't do that, they're not a candidate. No, there are some adaptations that you can make. Some platforms allow for closed captioning. Some allow for enlarging the screen for those that are more visually impaired. And again, with the parent being the facilitator, if maybe the child's dexterity does not allow him or her to click the mouse, that type of thing, then you can use hand over hand with the parent, and have the parent help the child learn how to do it, if it's a coordination thing, or help them, you know, even asking the child verbally, you know, instead of saying clicking on the red one, you say, what color would we choose for that? And have them verbally tell you. It takes a bit of getting used to get a feel for whether or not it's something that you can make work for a client per se. So just as if you're sitting across the table from him or her in your office thinking, okay, what activities would he or she benefit from that would really be, you know, applicable to the IEP goals or whatever the case may be. The same thing holds true here. You're a little more limited. It's all visual on your part because you can't reach through the screen to redirect the child. But looking at the capabilities, the cognitive, the physical, all of those types of things really plays a role in determining what type of telepractice you would use with a child. At this point in the pandemic, it's more not if, it's how.
Right.
How can we make this work? Before COVID-19 and then after the fact, it may be more stringent where it's like, okay, this child may not be a good candidate for telepractice, but then you can offer in-person services. Right
Okay.
now we don't have that capability.
Right. So it's less a matter of if and more a matter of how, and there are certain candidates that really aren't good candidates for teletherapy, but if under normal circumstances, of course, but probably more people are candidates than we realize. And it's just a matter of thinking outside the box, being creative about how we're utilizing what we have, and being resourceful.
Mm-hmm. Right. One thing too, that kind of ties in with everything that you've asked so far, even with the redirecting of the student. One thing I found for materials that really helps keep the kids engaged are pictures that are about them. So their family members, their pets, their siblings. So I find that a lot of times their focus is that much more involved or a part of the therapy session if you can make it more, the materials more applicable to them. And that's just something that I happen to think of off the bat there.
Yeah. So the more personal the materials are, the more engaged they are, which is probably true regardless of whether you're online or not.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what else, as far as figuring out how to use materials, what should clinicians do when it comes to picking the right materials, using what they have, and navigating that with teletherapy? What advice can you give there?
Well, if you're just starting out or have been thrown into it because of the pandemic, I'd use what you already have. So if you have hard copy materials at all, workbooks, worksheets, things like that, that you're going to incorporate, you can scan those in via a copier if you have one at home. There's even an app, I think, on my phone I used. It's Tiny Scan. It'll take a picture and put it in Google Drive. If you're using those materials strictly for your therapy purposes and you're not disseminating them to other clinicians or trying to sell them for some reason, the copyright issues are not an issue.
Yeah.
So using those materials that you have already, doing a Google search for educational activities for kids, for students, finding materials that way. There are a lot of free materials that are out there. It also probably offers some websites to look at that you might have interactive materials accessible through. Using blogs to get materials is another great way, looking up telepractice blogs or teletherapy blogs. There are free materials on Teachers Pay Teachers website. Some you can pay for too. I wouldn't, worry about trying to buy a lot of materials for, each student, that type of thing. Try to keep it as simple as possible. What I tend to do is if I'm starting up with a new group and it's just a matter of getting to know the students, I try to think of a generic activity that would apply to most situations. So there's a website, SLP now.
Okay.
And, yeah. And she has materials that you can use that are thematic. So she has adapted for articulation, language, and pretty much any type of language concepts, language grammar, you name it. That's more for probably geared towards younger kids, but she has some for older as well. So taking something like that, especially when you're first starting out, and if you feel like you're like, oh my gosh, how am I going to, plan for these 50 kids or how many ever that you're seeing, try to find an activity that's workable for a lot of different types of goals, and then, tweak it for each student if you need to. Always the self-introduction one is great starting out, hi, now we're working from home. So, if it's students that you normally saw on site, you can adapt it to like a introduction to working at home, or, having the student show you their house by, carefully carrying the laptop, those types of things. Anything that keeps the work that you feel you need to put into it at a minimum till you get your feet under you. And then you can always specialize and adapt and look into more and expand your materials library, that type of thing. And some platforms have materials built into them already, which is nice. So that's another consideration, depending on what platform you're using.
Right. So give yourself some grace aside from, is this the perfect therapy session clinically? Just get them used to the platform, get your feet under you, and then worry about those other things, set those expectations. And
right. I remember a professor of mine many, many years ago had said, you should be able to take a pencil, and if that's the only thing you have for therapy, you should be able to use it. So what would you do with a pencil that would allow a student to interact with you and meet those IEP goals? And it's like, I think of it that way, it simplifies things a lot. Even just a matter of, bringing up different pictures that you find online to work on grammar, or describing, or sequencing, or you name it. There's different ways to do it, but it doesn't have to be that complicated.
Right. A simple Google Doc or Word doc or something like that you already have access to, and just
exactly
adapt it. So I know we've talked about a lot of things so far. I think this is going to be really helpful for a lot of the people listening. Are there any other questions that people ask you or misconceptions about teletherapy that you wanted to share before we wrap up today?
Sure. I know the information out there before the pandemic, a lot of school districts, and I think a lot of people in general, had the understanding or the thought that telepractice is kind of like second best, or it's an alternative. It's not a great alternative, but it's an alternative to on-site therapy. That really isn't the case. I mean, obviously, if everybody could work on site and work with kids physically in the room, that type of thing, that would be ideal. But telepractice, and ASHA requires it, that telepractice is equal in the quality of the services as if you were in person. So it takes a little more tech savviness to be able to do that at times, but the quality of the service, the same requirements for an SLP that's providing telepractice, those requirements are the same as they are for an SLP working in person or on site. So we have the same licensure, we have the same certification, we have the same degree. I mean, I worked in schools for 24 years before I moved to telepractice. So the therapy sessions are only as good as the clinician, which is true for almost any profession.
Right.
So if you have a telepractitioner who is on top of things and is prepared and has materials and that are applicable, those types of things, the telepractice sessions and therapy itself should be equal to that of in-person services. So I'd like to remove that thought that it's not good enough. It's just, okay, well, if we have to do that, we'll do that. That shouldn't be the case. And if people have been led to believe that, it's a mistake. I'm sorry for that, because of the fact that isn't the fact. So
yeah, absolutely. And it has to be as good or better than in-person therapy. And so obviously with the laws, you just have to be licensed in the state that you're in and in the state that the client is in, right? So obviously you're providing services for your school district right now, everybody's in the same state. But if you were to want to start taking on private clients, you could do that locally or within your state, as long as they're in that state that you're in, and as long as you have a license for the state of all the clients that you're in, correct?
Correct. Two thoughts with that, though, is some people I happened to run across and I didn't really think about, is that some people drive across state lines to provide services. So they still have to be licensed in both states, but I think probably a bigger area of thought would be people coming from working maybe in a clinical setting where they only need the license to their professional department, like the Department of Health and Professional Services or Safety and Professional Services. When you're working with students that have IEPs and you're working through the school age population, some states require a second license. Like Wisconsin, we have one through Professional Services and the other one's through the Department of Public Instruction.
Yep.
You need to make sure that if the student's in the next door state, or if you're moving from a clinical setting to more of the school-based type of clientele, you're going to want to make sure that you have both licenses if the state does require that. Many states only have the one, but many states also have the two. So,
and I'm in Illinois, and we have ASHA, the Illinois Department of Professional Regulation, which is our state license, and then the Illinois State Board of Education. So national, so obviously ASHA,
National,
state, medical, and school. So when you're thinking about the state you're in, you want to think about all those three things and then check to see if there's anything else aside from that within whatever state that you're working in, and just
correct.
be aware of that.
Yep. And like you mentioned, if you're moving to like a more of a private practice, then wherever that client resides, you need to make sure that you have all the licensure required in that state as well. So,
Okay, good. So I know that you offer consulting for school districts and organizations that are wanting to get up and running for teletherapy. And do you also work with private practice owners who want to get up and running?
I do. Any of those, even universities that are looking at, one a presentation for telepractice or looking at potentially developing like a practicum, those types of things. You can find out more at my website, which is www.s as in Sam -L as in Larry teletherapyconsulting.com, and it explains the different types of services we provide.
Okay, so presentations, training for staff, some ongoing trainings, or maybe just some consulting if they wanted to book a session with you and do an audit of what they're doing, get set up, things like that, to make sure that they are meeting all their requirements, and if they wanted to look through different platform options and things like that.
And usually if they want to sign up through my website or contact me via my website, I offer usually like a 20 to 30 minute free consultation so I can get a feel for what information they're looking for and if we're a good fit too. So, and I know school districts have been reaching out more now with the pandemic because they're like, we need our SLPs trained. What do we do? So I'm also able to help in that aspect.
So if an SLP wanted someone that they could refer their administrator to, you could support them as well.
Correct.
Where else? So you've got your website. Are you on social media? Do you have any other places online where people can get information about what you do?
I do. I have a Facebook page, the same handle as we would say. It's kind of an old term, but same name. Yeah.
Post links below the video as well, but go ahead and share.
I'm trying to think off the top of my head. One of the problems I had with my hyphen in there is that sometimes you can include it, sometimes you can't in the name.
With your social.
Yep. So if you try S-L Teletherapy Consulting and that doesn't work, just do SL Teletherapy Consulting.
Okay.
And I'm LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I usually try to post anything that's happening in terms of trainings through social media, and there are a number of different telepractice groups out there. So you could do a search on Facebook, and there's probably like 7 different telepractice groups now. So I'll usually post information through them as well, besides my own website. So great.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom with us today. And it's been great to really dive into this with you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And it was fun. I appreciate all the great questions, and I hope people that are out there that are dealing with the pandemic and trying to get telepractice up and running, hopefully this information is useful. So
yeah, I'm sure it will be. Well, thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.